So I've got the Mesa Boogie 525 here, and I wanted to just kind of do some experimenting with it and compare it to a Mesa Boogie Mark III. Now, in my head, I have an idea about what the results of this sort of test might be. I'm going into a Fractal X load here. We'll be using the same cab for both amps, and I've got the gain at about 7.5, the treble at about 7, 6.5, 7, mids at halfway, bass at about 10, presence and master at halfway. Maybe we'll leave the EQ off, it's easier just to leave that out for the sake of minimising variables, I think. So we're going to have a go with this with the clean channel as well. I'll just start with everything, basically take some shots of this to make sure that I remember, and we'll run it in the fat mode, I think. So I think to compensate for that with the Mark III, I'll be pulling it out for the deep kind of shift. But let's just see what this thing sounds like, how they compare. So, clean tones. For some driven tones, check out just some riffage. Okay, so I think a fairly important caveat to make, I really like both of these amps. Obviously the Mark 525 is tiny, and that's really what its huge benefit is. Also, we're 25 watts compared to, I think, like 85 to 100 watts on the Mark III. These are basically gigging volumes is what I've got these set at. So you see the master volume on the clean is lower than on the drive channel. The drive channel comes out quieter at the same kind of master settings. So generally I run the clean at about where you see it, sort of 10 o'clock, and then the master on the drive I'd run at about halfway. And then you see the settings that I've got here. Sort of a fairly neutralish midpoint, and I'm not using the EQ, so hopefully we can get a fair representation of how both amps sort of sound with these rough settings. I'll show you 2C plus mode. Okay, so I'm actually really glad that I've done this little experiment. So I've got the Mark III down here at the moment, and this is what I've been reamping today to kind of compare the audio between the Mark 525 and the Mark III. And I was expecting, I think, maybe a more pronounced difference than there is. I've got I think the input gain on the Mark V is fixed at like 7.5 or something like that, so I've experimented, and that's where I've got it here. So the input gain on the Mark III got like 2 gains for each thing, so you've got an input gain which I think is fixed at 7.5, and then I put the lead gain to 7.5. They sound really similar, I think. What you do get with the Mark III is more of that low end kind of heft and stuff, which is probably what you'd expect, but the overall character of the thing I think is similar enough, and if you started to engage the graphic EQ, I feel like you'd maybe be able to get things even closer. The other point is, I think the Mark V is a bit more compressed, as you might expect. There's obviously more headroom in the Mark V, so in the mix some of that potentially comes out a bit louder when you've normalised things. So for instance, the Mark V clean behaves a little better in some ways, so maybe some of these tones might be a bit more mix ready. You know, the Mark III, because of that lower end kick and stuff, might muddy up the mix more than your Mark V would. So that's positive for me. The little Mark V is tiny, sounds really good, clearly, can hold its own with kind of the vintage Mark series amps, and has a reverb that works, and yeah, you know, the reverb all the way up on the Mark III, you can barely hear it, and that's typical of the older Mesa Boogies. And also the Mark V, you've got split controls, so that's useful to have. Sounds like a Mark series amp, a little bit more manageable for home, but there's so much volume in that amp if you want to start gigging it. You know, if you really need to keep up with a drummer, maybe the 35 or the full one, but I think for most of us these days a Mark 525 could get the job done. As I say, a bit less lower end. In the intro I was switching between both of the clips, which you would have seen on screen. I don't know if there's a huge amount of difference. I can show you in this little isolated clip, which I'll drag in now, sort of a good indicator of the difference. You can hear the Mark V kind of handles the lower notes a bit less flubbily, and the Mark III keeps that flub. That low end heft is still present. So it's the sort of difference that you might get if you put a tube screamer in front of it to kind of tighten things up, I guess, is what you kind of get out of the box with the Mark V. Also there's a Mark IV and Mark IIc Plus mode. The 2C Plus is the one that I think sounds a bit closer to the Mark III. The Mark IV, it's not massively different, it's just a slightly different voicing and maybe a smidge more gain. But that's kind of my conclusions, which I'm fairly happy with. So the Mark 525, I think, in my opinion, can hold its own with the Mark III and save your back. So if you're thinking, right, I've got a Mark III or I've got a Mark 525, do I want to go and buy a 32 kilogram thing, or do I want to gig this sort of 9 kilo thing and save my back? I think it's a bit of a no-brainer for me, having done this experiment now. Thank you for stopping by. If that was at all interesting, useful, feel free to like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you've got either amp, if you've had experiences with the Mark V, if you've got experiences with the Mark III. Let me know how you get on. Cheers.